So I usually start most podcasts by talking about the backdrop. You look like you have a custom painting behind you. I love the ambiance of the photo. Is that something that you painted? Where'd you come up with that picture?
No, I think I don't know why my printer's going off right now. Apparently that was good timing to start this off. Hopefully that's not an indication how the rest of the night's going to go. Sorry about that, but luckily it was a short print job. But no, actually, that painting, you know what? That was something generic. We went to just a normal store somewhere, and I don't remember where my wife and I did at our old house and purchased it. And it was kind of like we had this big like window room. It was kind of like a three seasons room that was kind of then converted with a gas burner. So we had that up on the wall. It was really awesome, like really eye catching. And then when we end up moving, we're like, where are we going to put it? And then I kind of had my office set up because I work from home a lot.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's perfect place for it. So
good spot for a deer podcast for sure.
Well, yeah, sometimes I have to blur out the background depending on, who's on the other end.
Yeah. Yeah, I just had to explain that the other day. Shortly after COVID started, I did a call and I had the coyote pelt hang us for my mounts were down here. About halfway through the call, I looked at my background. Then suddenly I was conscientious of what was behind me while I was having the conversation. And I'm trying to lean over like, hey, don't worry about it.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Well, man, I'm glad to get you on here. For folks on the forum, it's AT1010 is Albert's screen name. He is the resident soil guru for us. And one of the things that I think is really cool is to watch his passion grow over the years to go from really something that was a hobby in food plotting, which has a lot of different shapes and forms, and people do it a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different ways to, skin a cat, so to speak. And then to watch you over time take the education in your own hands and take it very seriously to, you're a very educated amateur soil biologist or, whatever the proper term would be for that. And now you've been able to spin that into this Vitalized seed venture in partnership with Jared and the Habitat podcast. I'll link my appearance on the Habitat podcast. I think about a little over a year ago now, I was able to talk to those guys about the farm. I want to talk to you a little bit about the farm and how it fits the company. But one of the things I'd like to hear is your elevator pitch, but also really kind of hone in on the diversity of the products. You only have two products, which I love, but those two products are 3 times as diverse as any other seed blend on the market. And there's a real reason behind that. So give me, I'm sold. But go ahead and try to sell me on why I should buy one of these mixes.
And yeah, well, I think that it kind of starts off with a little bit of history, if you will. So I don't know if I'm going to stick within the elevator pitch on this part, but I do want to give a little bit of background context. And, I started, we owned 60 acres for, I think it's 15 years now, something like that. And, first thing we wanted to do was primarily closed canopy forest. So first thing we wanted to do was put in food plots. Who doesn't, right? So we opened up, 3 acres or something. And then, a couple of years later, we were able to open up a little bit more around some old gas wells. And we were really blessed with an opportunity, both from a timing perspective as well as from a financial ability perspective, to purchase an additional 180 some odd acres there adjoining our 60 acre piece. So that's a game changer. Owning 250 acres and really good neighbors and things like that. It kind of went from like, wow, this isn't just go out and hope to have a deer or two on camera. It's like we can kind of manage some property, here and manage some deer. And we had neighbors around us were all very large landowners. 2 of them, one is 330 and the other one's over 500 acres, pretty much adjoining us, and we're all on the same page. And I added it up one time. I had like 2,200 acres of neighbors that are all on the same page. Now there might be 20 or 40 here somewhere. We're fairly broken up. But anyhow, so the deer hunting was getting better. But I also continue to have this interest, not only because I'm a big gardener, but also from a deer food plotting perspective and soil and learning more about it. And, I was reading a lot back then on the QDMA forums. So that's been shut down for probably 7-8 years now, I think.
Yeah, at least.
Yeah, it's been a little bit. There was a lot of guys there who, just like anywhere, there's the loudest guys might not be the most knowledgeable, but they would chime in all the time. But there were some dudes who were just fantastic and really knew a ton of stuff. And the problem was there was a lot of contradicting information. And I'm just somebody who, as I learn, it's like, why? I'm like a 2-year-old. I just keep asking why,
Right.
And so I really got interested in that. And when we purchased that additional land, well, it had really good bedding on it because it had been select cut. Our neighborhood was already heavily, just due to natural timber cut, right? Like it had probably all been cut 30, 40 years ago. So like every 5 years, it seemed like something was getting cut. Like I added it up one time. I think I added like 1,000 acres of ground that had been cut within like 2 or 3 square miles. Like it just was kind of in that time frame where people were like, hey, time to cash in, so we didn't have a lack of bedding. We had a fair number of whitetails around. So it's like, what's the limit of research? There's no ag, just no real ag to speak of. And even the cattle industry has gone down so much in our part of the state there that it was like most of the even pastures and stuff were kind of just left fallow. It's not like they were getting fertilized or planted anymore. So it's like, what could we do? Well, we need to have really good quality food. So I went after it the traditional way, and I started doing, 8 acres, 9 acres, 10 acres a year, and doing it twice a year. And I'm pulling soil samples, and I'm going, okay, this is going to be $1,000 bill in the spring, and it's going to be, $1,000 bill in the fall. And at that point, shoot, I was 22, 23 years old, something like that, and this is probably, close to that. And, 6, 7 years ago, somewhere in there, and maybe even a little bit longer. And and then timing too. So I had a traditional tiller, and I just didn't have the time to till that much ground, So life gets busy, meet a girl, you get married, you have a kid.
Yeah.
I'm like, I can't. I was tilling, letting it grow back, spraying, going in there, and then seeding, maybe lightly tilling again. Because that was a lot of the stuff that was pitched. Like, hey, you want a weed-free plot.
Right.
And then I'd go back, and if I did soybeans, say, then I'd go back and spray them again if they were Roundup Ready soybeans at, I don't know, the 2 or 3 week stage where they're still pretty pliable. And I'd go back in there and spray them again. And now, I don't have time to
No way.
get the bill, let alone go and be spraying and stuff like that often.
That's $1,000 bill now too.
Oh yeah.
By glyphosate.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, just, and fuel. I mean, goodness gracious.
Yep.
So I really was interested in trying to find another way. And I started playing around with, all right, I'm going to do clover fields, and I just had monoculture clover fields. Now there were multiple blends, but essentially they were monocultures, right? Because I didn't have anything other than really clover, at least all spring. And I remember people just would harp on this seed to soil contact. And I always thought of it, and it's probably not the best analogy, but I always thought, well, the way God designed an oak tree, they regenerate. Like nobody, I guess squirrels do plant them in some cases, but now I think of that. Or I think of the native prairies and all of these stuff. I'm like, it doesn't have to be this perfect seed to soil contact that we've been sure. Now it's different if you're farming, right? That's a totally different discussion. You have to have rows. So the combine, that's a totally different discussion in efficiency. So I would just start trying stuff. And I remember I still have the picture saved in my phone, but I took a bushel of rye grain and radish and I overseeded it into a clover field that could have been on the picture of a magazine.
Yeah.
And people's like, oh, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. And I came back the next spring to that particular field. And I kind of had thought in the fall, it didn't work. I was wrong, Well, what happened is it actually worked very well. And the deer just kept the rye trimmed before it could ever get ahead of the clover.
Yeah.
But the following spring, the rye bolted. And there was not a weed in that field because rye is allelopathic. It's like a black walnut, right? So it will suppress weeds, especially weed seeds from germinating, right? So sometimes people get that confused. They think, oh, it's allelopathic. You can't grow it because it'll kill the next crop. no, that's not true. It's while it's growing, its root exudates, which basically what it roots pump into the soil, are two different types of acids, primarily organic acids, I believe is what they fall under, and they tend to suppress weed seed from germinating. So what I ended up having is this clover field with ryegrain all over the top. Talk about this time of year, turkeys are going nuts because they're eating all the heads. So I had turkeys in there. The clover field was perfect, and all I have to do is go in there with a bush hog and bush hog it off, and my clover field's totally back. And what I'm thinking, well, that rye had to have used something to grow. Was it that nitrogen in the clover? So I started learning more and more and more and diving into this and just saying, maybe I can cycle nutrients without having to spend all this money on fertilization.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the background story. So fast forward to, Vitalize Seed and what we, got going is, I started making my own custom mixes from that point on and making them more and more and more diverse and learning more about complementary products and the fungal networks in the soil. And I just didn't feel like anything out in the marketplace was really giving you simple to digest mixes. Even anybody that was similar in their marketing of a product that's highly diverse, you'd go to their website and they'd have 15 other mixes. And it would be like, well, and that's not a knock on them, right? It's a really good business strategy because then you can appeal to the masses. But I have a full-time job. I'm like, I just want to bring something. All these people who keep throwing around this term, like it keeps throwing around so much, I'm almost starting to resent the term, but it's soil building.
Yep.
And it's like, I wanted to bring something out that truly is functioning as a system.
Yep.
So I wanted to make a spring and summer mix with a really highly diverse, I think it's 13 species.
Yeah.
Focus is heavy on the legumes. So you're going to get benefit for the soil is, of course, you're going to get your nitrogen. Typically, I'm just going to talk about nitrogen on this type of podcast because we could go down the rabbit hole, but let's just focus on nitrogen. But there's a lot of other great things happening as well through diversity.
Right.
You have broadleaves, being sunflowers, being your buckwheat. Those two plants alone are awesome for things like honeybees.
Yeah.
Which is important to our whole ecosystem, right? You have diversity in root structure. You also have, when I made this mix, I'm like, well, guys aren't all going to have a no-till drill. Guys aren't all going to have even a disc, right? Like a lot of guys don't even have a disc. So what are guys going to be doing? So I'm like, well, we got a lot of good soybeans in our mix. We got a Eagle Forage soybean, which I'm really excited to talk to. That's in our mix. We also have a really nice ag bean. That's, the Eagle Forage beans are awesome because they can handle a lot of different browse or heavy browse.
I'm looking at a bag of Eagle Forage soybeans here, so I'm a believer. Yep.
Oh yeah, I mean they work. I've done side-by-side testing. I mean they definitely can handle browse. And there's other forage soybeans out there, but I think Eagle has done something really, really unique. And they truly do grow their soybeans. I've actually been told before they have, not to go too far. See, you got to keep me on track, but they do have another farm in Brazil because to get the epigenetic triggers similar to like whitetails, like typically the triggers take like 7 years or two generational series to actually make impact. And it's like, well, I guess with plants, I think it's 7 years as well. And that might just be a total coincidence. I don't think there's any like specific duration. I'm sure it changes based on plant physiology, but it's interesting because they have done it where they grow plants in the northern and southern hemisphere, because by doing so, they can get 2 growing seasons per year. So they can cut that down from 7 years to 3.5.
Yep.
Which that's very different because a lot of things in this marketplace are, I've made the super duper Albert mix or Albert soybean, and it's just like, well, it's just a late maturing ag bean that you put Albert's name on it.
Yeah.
Whereas like Eagle is truly the growers, like they're the producers, which is I think that's really cool. And I think they deserve a lot of credit. Not that they care what I say, but I think it's pretty cool how they do that. So with our mix, I wanted to also make sure that we're diversified, not only in the species and having legumes, but also having plants that like nitrogen, right? And I can explain a little bit about why that's important, but also size of seed. So one of the things that you can get in trouble with is if you try to do just a monoculture of soybeans and you just try to broadcast them and you don't want to disturb the soil profile by tillage or disking or whatnot, or if you don't have enough thatch, you end up having a situation where you have a lot of predation on that particular soybean. So you have to, do I have to triple or quadruple my seed mix or double, or what is it, right? And it might vary depending on who you're talking to and how much seed they want to sell. But what I wanted to do is not only diversify our mix from a type of plant standpoint, but I also wanted to diversify from seeding size. It's like we got hairy vetch, really small seed. I got sun hemp, small seed. I got buckwheat, medium-sized seed. Soybean, larger seed, again, somewhat variable depending on the previous year's harvest and how much rain and all that. The seed size changes year to year. But I mean, ballpark, technically a larger seed. Sunflower, technically a larger seed. So I wanted to diversify. So yeah, the guy who has a half acre and he's just broadcasting it like a son of a gun, it's like he might not get 5 foot tall sunflowers and chest high soybeans. And well, first off, because of browse, but he's going to get some success. He's going to have a significant amount of diversity in there because of just the seed size alone. So what we did with our mixes is I've been playing around with these for 6 years. I have not tilled or fertilized on any of my fields. If you go to our website, you'll see where all the pictures on the website are don't go to the website, go to the forum. I mean, all of those have no fertilizer on them, and they're as like big as my ball cap. Turnips, brassicas, other brassicas, rye, radish, the hairy vetch crawling in between the stuff, and it's green as could be, really, really healthy, and it's all through nutrient cycling. So I've been playing with these, and that's where I just wanted to make one mix in the spring that basically feeds our fall mix.
Yep.
Fall mix takes all the goodies from the spring, absorbs those, cycles them back, and that spring mix is actually going to help to break down that fall mix the next spring when you plant into it again. And that's really, if somebody wants to learn more about it, or if you have questions, I'm happy to go into it. But that's really where you get into the carbon and nitrogen ratios of each individual plant, or an average based on the mix, and how that nutrient cycling works.
Yep. There's one question that comes to mind, but I want to set a little bit of context because you and I have went back and forth about this over the years. Whereas Albert is sort of this is the systems approach. It's scientific. There's a process here. I am the guy who's just really just half-assed it my whole food plot career. I've been pretty lucky with decent soils, always been very busy. So grabbing time to do the soil test has been one thing, but I've been, access to equipment's been something that I've been fortunate to have. So I am sort of the traditional made for TV food plotter and always have been. And I famously claim that I haven't soil tested in 15 years until I bought Award Laboratories soil test from you guys. I wanted to be a patron early on, and I will get a soil test. I picked up some acres this year. We kicked off a traditional ag operation from the farm that gives me more access to this. This is why I'm very interested in planting your blend. With the Eagle seeds, I got the inoculate sitting on the bag. Are you needing to add an inoculate to your mix, or is this something that, is there a reason why that's not necessary when I run it into 12 other seeds and put it in the ground?
So you could, it wouldn't hurt. You could buy an inoculant for the seeds. To be honest, we have not had any issue in that. And our clover seeds are already pre-inoculated and coated. So we use Lanza fixation clover and things like that. So in most cases, I'm not an expert on rhizobacteria, but in most cases, soils have natural, like black medic, for example, is a native that grows in a lot of areas. You'll see it in is that alfalfa or bird's foot trefoil? But it's actually black medic.
Okay.
And you'll see it, and it's typically fixing nitrogen, and it's just naturally in the soil profile. So I think unless you're really in heavily, heavily degraded soils, you need to add inoculant. It's not that expensive. You can do it, but you'd have, if you're going to do it in a highly diverse blend, you would want to get a broad spectrum inoculant. Okay. To be honest, I don't use it, and I've pulled soil samples for 6 or 7 years continuously. And I've never seen anything. Plus, looking at the root structure, you can see the nitrogen being fixed. I've never seen a need to.
Yeah.
But you absolutely could do it. And I think you have a little bit of a risk there too when you're planting monoculture. That if you're planting monoculture in a degraded soil and you don't have any other plants in the system that are inoculated, like in our system, that you might not have any bacteria. So it's better off like, hey, for a couple extra bucks, let's just throw that in there.
That makes sense. The other thing that pops in my mind is I think about all the craze around clover, early 2000s. Whitetail Institute was driving a lot of that. Ladino clover was sort of all the rage. If you weren't a food plotter, if you weren't planting Ladino, and that's a lot of that's obviously changed when it comes to clovers. What's your number one to, like, if a guy's going to think about custom blending his own thing, clover, that's been my favorite plot. It's been the most consistent. I don't have a lot of destination. I'm going to use the jury conversation of destination feed fields versus kill plots, food plot architecture, right? I have very well-defined kill plots. I now will have a destination field that I'm working with, and that's where I want to put your product. But, my kill plots that are clover, there's this guy right here, the wide 8-point sitting right there, was the proof that those little tucked away clover plots are a great place for them to stand and mellow out, and for the does to chill, and for them to come and check. So, if a guy wants to pick the premium clover for his mix, what should he be looking for?
Well, I mean, it kind of, I hate to say just, it kind of,
you're going to say it's going to depend on the soil. What's your soil test say?
No, honestly, it's depends on the grower's goals, right? So do you want a perennial clover?
For sake of argument, yes. I want something that I can count on, spray, mow, maintain, and look luscious and green year 3, 4, 5.
Gosh, you're really testing me, because I'm trying to think of a perennial. Well, medium red is always great. I mean, there's so many other like variations of basically like a white clover, so I don't know.
Is it Alaska? Is that right? Am I saying that right?
Well, there's Alice, there's Alice, there's Arrowleaf, there's Azlike, there's so like I love Arrowleaf. It's a cool clover. Is it Aberlast?
That's what I'm thinking about. Aberlast is in the Merit seed blend that I've had a lot of really good success with in the past.
And it's a cool clover. For me, my favorite clover, it's not even freaking close, is Crimson.
Yep.
Crimson clover, which is a heavy reseeding annual. So you could, if you manage, it's not like hard to manage it, but if you plant it in the fall and mow it in the spring, once it's all seeded out, like, you're going to get more crimson going.
Yep.
I love it so much I put it in both mixes because it's just a fibrous root system from a soil health perspective.
Yeah.
You'll stand by a field of crimson clover and you'll just hear zzz. I mean, the bees are just in there so heavy. I mean, the turkeys eat the heads right off. The stalk is fibrous. Like, it's just an awesome clover. So if I had to do something, I'd probably go with like a white, a crimson, and I'd plan on probably adding crimson. Anytime I got light, I'd be adding more crimson if I wanted to maintain the clover field over the years. Yeah. And then maybe like medium red. I mean, that's just, but you could pick that Aberlast. You could pick quite a few of the different Arrowleaf, or do a couple of different ones. It's something I might get into eventually, is trying to do like a really diverse clover mix.
Yep.
But it also is going to depend a little bit on, clover's a weird crop, and it's like brassicas, and there's some guys love it and some guys say my deer won't eat it. I had a beautiful clover stand, but my deer won't eat it. Brassicas is the same thing.
Perfect segue, man. I was going to ask you to sort of dress on that, because the old adage was, we'll keep planting the brassicas, they'll eventually figure out how to eat it. And I can say, from somebody that's been food plotting on the same farm for 15 years, I have grown those magazine quality, those magazine cover quality food plots. And my deer just absolutely will not eat them. The clover, they demolish. The brassicas, and I'm not sure what it is about the biodiversity or just the deer herd in general, but it's been a real struggle.
So I'll tell a story to answer that question, and then I'll get into this, like a little bit of the science behind it. I hate you saying that too, because I'm not a scientist, but I'm just a dude who likes to read a lot. But yeah, obviously Ohio, you can bait. It's a big bait state. One of our neighbors are real good, really good people. And they bait a lot, right? Like I know they are. They're not shy about it. They're open about it. They shot a pile of does a few years ago, and I've shared this on other podcasts and stuff. So I'll make it brief. But long story short, this past year I was talking to them, and they're like, "Man, we're just not seeing the deer." I'm like, "Well, you probably killed them all," kind of thinking. But all joking aside, I'm like, that's kind of weird because I was fortunate to shoot a buck early and had already killed a doe or two. So I wasn't really hunting gun season. So I put my uncle in a spot where I'm like, yeah, he's going to see deer for sure. It's just a matter if he sees one that he wants to shoot. So I talked to these guys a couple of days later, or excuse me, a couple of days before, and they're like, yeah, we're not seeing many deer this year. So it's like Tuesday or Wednesday of gun season. So deer have been shot at and missed, and they're holing up, and my uncle comes in from the hunt, and I'm like, yeah, I didn't hear you shoot or whatever. And did you not see any deer tonight? It seemed like it had been a good night. I can't remember. I think it was a cool night, like that second or third day of gun season. I'm like, it should have been a good night, He's like, oh no, I saw 18, And I'm like, you saw 18 tonight? That's a pretty good night for, we definitely have deer around, but that's a pretty good night for us. And he's like, oh yeah. He's like, I just sat up there because it was late when he got back, And he's like, I just sat up there till they left because I didn't want to blow them off. And I'm like, well, what were they doing? I'm asking all these. He's like, they just were eating, man. They just were eating. So there's corn less than a half a mile away. And those deer are in those brassicas and clovers and vetch, awesome. That diversity eating. And I have pictures of about a week before I shot my buck. I have turnips, and I shot my deer this year, November 3rd. So about a week and a half before that, I was checking some cameras and stuff. And I had turnips pulled out of the ground, consumed by deer. So I think that a lot of times it has to do with we can grow really, really healthy looking crops with synthetic inputs. And I'm not anti-fertilizer. I'm not, I could do a whole podcast just on that. But when it comes to concentrate selectors, white-tailed deer, and people go, well, why did they pick that autumn olive over this greenbrier? Greenbrier is a smilax. That's a native plant. Why did they pick that autumn olive? And it's like, well, maybe it's because of the soil that it's growing in. Maybe it has something to do with that. Yep. Maybe not. Maybe it was just getting its fill because it needed to balance its rooming. But the point being is, I think when guys, the traditional recommendation for brassicas is plant your brassicas, put down 200 pounds of urea per acre, something along those lines, right? Some people go, no, it's 100 pounds. Like, I don't care.
It is what it is. Yep. It's close.
Yeah. And it's like, well, what we do know from a microbiological perspective, right, is as we increase our synthetic fertilizer input, we slow our microbial activity in the soil. We slow our plants' communication with the soil. The best analogy I can use, it's like a guy using steroids. Your body stops making testosterone. Why? Because it's getting fed testosterone.
Right.
It doesn't need to produce testosterone. It doesn't need to communicate with your own microbiome to produce that. So what happens when you're just dumping that onto the soil? Well, what also happens is most granular fertilizers are heavy salt or chloride. You'll hear these terms. Well, what does that mean? Well, they're oxidizers. So what is like a redox reaction? If you go back to chemistry class in high school, you probably heard about redox reaction, reduction or oxidation. The best example I can give to keep it like super simple is just think of iron. When iron is oxidized, it rusts. When it's oxidized, it's no longer bioavailable. So not only do you risk the chance of having your macronutrients not being available and nutrient dense in that plant. Now you're growing a healthy plant, but the nutrient density isn't exactly there. So you increase your susceptibility to pest and disease. You don't reduce it. You also oxidize or increase the risk of oxidation, especially year over year, right? Because like you said earlier, the tip was just keep planting them. Just keep dumping the salt to it, And hey, if 200 pounds is good, might as well use 300 on a half acre.
Yeah.
You know, and you would grow these plants, and brassicas are a good one to talk about. It's a little bit of yellow. What does the internet tell us to do? Well, it's not a potassium deficiency. It's not an iron deficiency. It needs nitrogen. Throw nitrogen to it. Well, so yeah, why would the deer not be eating those brassicas? I have a hard time believing it's that they just simply don't like turnips.
Right.
Because I know within my area, probably, not that great of a distance, there are guys who will say, my deer won't eat them. I'm like, we're like, a deer could probably travel between the two. It's not that far, you know. And you look at some of those MSU deer studies, they had deer travel like, what was it, 22 miles or something in one direction?
Yeah.
You know, it's 18 miles, something like that. It's crazy. So that's my theory. I can't prove that. You can take that with a grain of salt because it could be total bullshit. But that's my theory on how nutrient density impacts what deer select or don't, and especially within certain crop species.
Well, so that makes some sense. One, because I already admitted to being a half-ass food plotter. So soil testing and doing amendments, like I grew good food plots without any of that. But to your point, so what am I missing? What am I not feeding? But the thing that came to mind while you were talking is that this is not a conscious decision from the deer. This is something in their physiology, in their microbiomes, that when we hit spring green up, and all of that green browse is full of phosphorus and they're overloading their system. Now I got to seek out the salt and the sodium to counteract the phosphorus. And so it's just this natural cycle. So what you're saying makes a ton of sense to me, in that, you know, if one food plot over here or one food source over here is effectively communicating with their body and saying, hey, you're way deficient on this, that, or the other, then, you know, an animal that eats 200 plus different species of food, or whatever that number really is, but it, you know, it's a tremendous number. They're just going to filter around until they find whatever it is that satisfies that internal mechanisms that's telling them like, hey, you're deficient here.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I mean, like, I follow some cattle guys, and the science behind understanding the rumen is just, I mean, it's freaking, it's mind blowing. But you know, a deer is similar, right? It's a rumen animal. It's going to balance that out. And I think you could probably have an argument for this, but again, I'm just kind of thinking as we're talking. I forget that we're recording sometimes, so if I sound like an idiot, just let it go. But you know, when you have an area where there is a heavy presence of corn, well, the deer have to balance that rumen out. So it's like, let's say you're, oh, man, I don't want to spend money on corn. I have the time to corn. Well, if you can get a really strong food plot system established, although the deer might be on your neighbors eating corn, and that's, everybody battles that, right? That's just kind of nature-owned land in Ohio. But if you have really good, highly diverse, highly nutritious food plots, they're going to make their way over to you once they realize that they're there. It might not be year one, because it's going to get progressively and exponentially better, but they got to balance that out. You know, they have to balance that rumen out, because that corn is heavy carbs, right? And they need to balance that out with leafy greens and things like that. You know, and interestingly enough, all the deer we shot this year off the farm, I cut their rumen open and kind of examined it, you know, and it's amazing to see how little corn is in there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of like, it's something I recommend guys do. Like, if you're kind of like, where are these deer spending time? Because trail cameras help and stuff. But it's such a small picture. Cut the rumen open.
Right.
You know, like, smell it. You're like, oh man, you could almost smell acorn crunched up. Or if it's just greens, like, it doesn't smell like anything, just leafy green, you know, or whatever. But like, it's kind of a neat way to like analyze, where are those deer, you know, especially if it's a mature doe, her rumen will be full as a tick. And it's like, you can sit there and really analyze, where is this deer spend a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, people do that with the crops on turkeys, but for whatever reason, we won't do that with deer.
Yeah.
Unless we do it ourselves accidentally.
Yeah, accidentally, because you had too many beers. Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Too many celebratory beverages. Yeah, I've been there.
Oh yeah.
That reminds me if we just told the story yesterday. We were talking about busting the stomach. What's your worst experience with busting the stomach on a deer and a gut job? And I killed a deer on opening day one time hunting with a buddy here behind the house, and I shot her really early. And I waited for him so I didn't ruin his hunt. It's not a small, I got 11 acres here. So I was clear on the back end if I leave. So we wait. By the time I get her, it's pushing 10 o'clock on opening day. And I was talking to him, and I turned sideways like this, and I went to lay my knife back down right as I turned back to look at the deer. And just enough to, first gut job of the year, the knife is super sharp, right in my face. And he's a real sensitive kind of guy when it comes to that stuff. And hey, Dustin and Dave, this is for you. That's what I heard as soon as that thing hit me in the face. And it took me 2 days to get the smell of that deer off.
Oh, yeah.
So
that's hilarious.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about was I inherited a 3-acre traditional ag field. I'm going to guess that we've been rotating corn and beans now for 9 years, I think, on that. And interestingly enough, last week, I attended our local Farm Bureau policy meeting. They have a breakfast once a quarter, and I did that for my professional job. But obviously, I'm there in this. I admitted to being the only habitat farmer in the crowd, and we got to talking about invasives. And so what I have seen both, and I think a lot of people are seeing this, poison hemlock and Johnson grass. But the Johnson grass just crept in like crazy and this is part of why we kicked the farmer off, was he was doing no maintenance. Yeah. And I know you and I talked a little bit about like, what's it going to take to destroy the rhizomes and all of that. From your experience and some of the reading you've been doing about, sort of that subsoil component of these plants, Johnson grass has got a reputation for being pretty doggone hardy. Any pointers or suggestion with people out there? I'm not the only one that's dealing with this creep. It's not just sticking to road ditches. Now it's went from just the edges of a food plot. And don't get me wrong, I love the cover. I liked it when it was just a ring around the cornfield. Yeah. But now it's encroaching upon the actual, what I want to be vitalized seed for a year or two is going to maybe have to compete with some Johnson grass in the corner until I figure this thing out.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where, not to go back to the elevator pitch, but one of the things that I wanted to do when I formed this company is I felt like the food plot industry in and of itself is, and even the ag, because I follow a ton of ag guys, because it's like, if you're going to learn from guys who are paying their bills with it, right? Like, yep. So I just felt like it was so polarizing. Like the one guy, I like cover crops, but then you have the guy like, yeah, but you don't terminate them the right way. It was like this one up of everything. I'm like, guys, there's got to be somewhere in the middle, and that's kind of where I fall. So like, if I'm not going to bullshit you, like I can't sit here and tell you, oh, use Liberty at this quart per acre and use some AMS, and it's going to roast Johnson grass. Like I'm sure we could find something. But what I will say is I'm an advocate for removing invasive species, taking care of it, because we need to do something before we can start. So even if that means, man, we got to run a disc through there, we got to burn it off, like and some invasives actually respond really well to fire. So don't just assume that that's a good thing to do. Right. But to me, I'm not one of these guys, like I don't almost resent the term regenerative anymore, because it's like, I don't think it's well defined. I mean, I know regenerative agriculture farmers, at least that's how they classify themselves, and they're willing to use Roundup, which I think is awesome. I'm like, that's cool. They're showing that they're still using herbicide. They're using it correctly. They're not, just spraying it all over everything, but they feel it's good for their farm. God bless them. Like, that's the way I look at this. But then of course there's other guys who, and I'm not talking if you're organic. I'm talking if you just have a chip on your shoulder and you say, well, I'm better because I don't use herbicide. I think it's a really loose argument. And it's just like, there's not really any quantifiable data to make one person better than the other. It's like, let's just all get along. So what I wanted to do with the seed company is like, let's find a solution for every single individual piece of property. So like I talked to one guy and he's like, hey, I have a disc. I really need the disc. I'm like, all right, well, let's do it. Here's some things to consider. when you disc, if you disc real deeply, what are you doing? And I went through all of these. So in your situation, I think we need to just do some digging onto, okay, what are the best chemical treatments?
Yep.
And really try to set it back. Now, sometimes with some of those invasives, as you disturb the soil, it's going to be worse. So then it's like, do you give up? Do you spray it a couple times? And then do you give up thatch cover? And possibly, you just know you're not going to have the germination if there's no thatch and you just throw the seed out. You might be giving up a little bit of visual appeal, right? That first year or two.
Yep.
But you're not bringing the Johnson grass seed or however it spreads, because again, I'm not an expert on it, back up to the soil surface. What I can tell you is once you get the system established and we're planting heavy grains and we're keeping the soil covered as much as possible, even with tillage. Like I know you have a tiller, you and I discussed that. It's like, we can do conservation tillage. This has been around for a long time. I mean, there's farmers who will talk to you about it from the 1970s. Yeah. Like, this isn't a secret. It's just like, just because somebody tills doesn't mean they have to till the whole thing at 8 inches deep and leave it dry for 2 months. Like, right. You can lightly till to the point where you're leaving 30, 40, 50, 80% thatch cover on the top.
Yep.
Now, is it as good as no till? I don't know. I mean, what's the CEC of the soil? We could go down that rabbit hole too, and you might be even getting some potential benefits for at least that initial crop, for faster OM breakdown and nitrification and things like that happening, or N mineralization and things like that happening, so that you're getting that faster boost. Because giving oxygen into your soil profile is like giving, a good buddy of mine farms in Georgia, and he's like, it's like giving candy to a 2-year-old.
Yeah.
It's all this, like the microbes get really excited because it's all this oxygen, right? So they're pumped up, it's hot, it's eating. So if you have cover and plenty of cover, and they have plenty of food to eat in your crops here, like, you could probably make some arguments that there's some benefits. That's why a lot of farmers now are doing strip tilling. That's a huge thing, especially in lower CEC soils like down south. Again, I mean, I have a buddy, Caleb, and I mention him on almost every podcast I've ever done, but he farms and consults between the two on like 20,000 acres in the Southeast. And they have like very low soils, very, very tough growing conditions. And I've learned so much from him that it's like, it's just given me a different perspective. Like anything, it's good to learn from a really diverse group of individuals. If you get too much tunnel vision, and I think that's happened a lot in this industry, you can kind of you can hurt your own self from educating others.
Right. So you've pretty much told me on seed, but I want to dig up one of our text exchange from the other day, because you talked about terminating crops, and I asked you to sort of give me your opinion regarding rollers versus all of these crimpers. I'd been getting pounded on Instagram from the crimpers, and I feel like I've acquired a fair amount of equipment over the years, and I'm like, do I really need another piece of equipment? I have a roller, it does what it does, but if I start getting into crops where, like buckwheat, right, if you're doing the Jeff Sturgis style, where you're going to go down and mash everything down, is that crimper? Intuitively, I looked at it and I'm like, come on, can it really be that much better? So can you kind of re-articulate what it is that you told me in text message, or why you really kind of are getting what you pay for if you do the crimper?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a hot topic, right? And I think some people might get upset by this response, but I think crimpers are cool.
Yeah,
I think they're really cool. I'm not against a crimper by any means. I might own one day. So let's preface this with that.
Yep.
But I also think that there's a lot pitched in the market today that makes people feel, if you don't have a crimper and an $8,000 crimper and a $15,000 no-till drill, and your kids aren't going to college, that you're not going to be able to kill good deer or have healthy soil. And I just think that it's been exaggerated, and marketing is a very powerful tool. And personally, I ask why a lot, right? So I've talked to some farmers and they're like, well, I played around with a crimper. Here are some negatives. If you have multi-species cover crop, they're not all going to be ready to be terminated at the same time.
Yep.
If your ground is uneven, and I'm like, well, where Jesse and I are, there's no even ground.
Like, is there such a thing?
Yeah, it's like, well, there's not a part where
nope.
I don't even enjoy driving the tractor around. I'm puckered the whole time. Like,
yep.
So he's like, well, you're going to get uneven termination, so you're probably going to have to use herbicide anyways. Following up. Okay, let's keep going down this list. What are some positives? Well, if you have a monoculture and it's all seeding out at the same time, you have level ground, you can kill it. What is another negative? You have to go fairly slow to terminate the cover crop. What's a positive? You don't have an herbicide bill, hopefully.
Yep.
Hopefully. You have good thatch cover.
Yep.
Hopefully it terminates well. You have a good standing cover there. So you can kind of go down this list. What I found interesting is I follow a gentleman. He's a huge organic farmer out of northern Indiana, Rick Clark. And Rick had mentioned that, I forget what podcast it was on, but it was maybe 2 years ago or something like that. But he had mentioned he's like really struggling with trying to terminate multi-species cover crop, especially ones with like hairy veg. And he can't use any herbicide because he's OMRI certified. So they started using flail mowers. And the reason they use the flail mower over a bush hog is just to avoid the wind rowing, right? Like a bush hog will terminate crops, but or at least decently enough, especially for the wildlife industry. But they were using flail mowers because you get almost a perfect distribution of thatch.
Yep.
One of the negatives of that is that because you fine cut the thatch, if you have a decently high microbial population, even with a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio of a plant species like corn or rye grain or something like that has a higher carbon to nitrogen ratio, it's going to take longer to break down naturally. But when you've broken it up and diced it up, obviously, like it's going to break down even faster. Yep. So that's one possible negative of this. But interestingly enough, I really respect Rick Clark. I mean, he's been doing this for a long time, really well-known, huge farmer in northern Indiana. But I'm like, I want to dig into this a little bit more. So I started Googling it, and I actually found, I forget if it was an NRCS study or a USDA study. Now, well, one of the same roughly, but they had done a study with crimpers, flail mowers. There was one other mechanical means for termination. And what was awesome about this is that the flail mower had the highest rate after 3 weeks of termination compared to all others. And it wasn't a huge variance. It was 2 to 5% variance. But still, I thought, well, isn't that something? Because again, you can buy a flail mower for it depends on the size, but let's just say $2,500, $3,500.
Yeah. Well,
you could use that to mow all the ditches around the farm. Like you can do a lot of stuff with a flail mower.
Yep.
You anywhere where you have a fence row or a fence, and you're like, even like a bush hog will swing sometimes, depending on the size of it and how tight you have to wood. Well, flail mower is sweet because it looks like it fits like a tiller. It's like tight to your PTO, yep. And everything. So you can just run that along the fence. And not saying you can't pay it. You still got to pay attention, but you can do a lot of cool things with that. Whereas like a crimper, that's it. Like that's what you got. You're going to be crimping food plots. Right. So, and then of course the last method to talk about, and I think it would be foolish of us not to, is just like one farmer, he goes, I can drive, I'll get it wrong, but 3 times faster with a 100-foot boom and glyphosate.
Yep.
And terminate my crops. And I'm putting down, whatever, it's very minimal, a quart per acre of glyphosate with ammonium sulfate in the tank to make sure that you're getting good kill off and agitating the water and everything like that. And a crimper, he's like, I can crimp 5 foot at a time and I got to drive 4 miles an hour.
Right.
like, so not saying that we're far, but it is something to think about because it's like, well, time is money for everybody. Like, so those are my takes. I think that crimpers are really cool. I think they can play a role. I think they work awesome with monocultures. I think that if they were $2,500, I'd probably be more interested in them. But the cost of them, I think, has gotten to the point where I'm not as interested as I once was.
Right. Well, I'm a huge fan of Good Eats, if you know the show, Alton Brown, and he was always big on like there are no monotaskers in the kitchen. Right. Like you don't do that. Every tool needs multiple uses. And frankly, farmers are the same way. Like, you know, a one use tool doesn't find its way to too many farms. Right. There's some essentials in there of which a crimper is not an essential.
Yeah. Right. And that's where I mean, there's been a lot of guys who've been super successful with them over the years, and it's awesome. And I think it's great. And I wish them nothing but additional success. For the recreational guy to spend, I don't know even what the costs are anymore, Jesse, but I mean, I have seen some 8, 9, 10 grand for some of these things. And I'm like, I could have got another 12 horsepower out of the tractor.
No kidding. Yeah, exactly.
You know, like I'd rather have a grapple on the front end than this crimper that I'm going to use twice a year, maybe.
You can get yourself into a nice compact tractor with a brush hog for $8,000 or $9,000 if you take your time and shop.
Yeah. See, and that's so. I mean, you could save the money and put it on down payment when the farm next door goes to sale. Like, there's just so many other things that my mind thinks about versus, you know, this moral dilemma of should I use glyphosate or not?
Right.
Like, even with glyphosate being expensive, how many 150-gallon jugs of glyphosate would I have to buy? I'd be 300 years old.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a great point.
Like, and I'm not saying I use Roundup on my farm. I use it once every 12, 13 months.
Yeah.
Unless I'm spraying Tree of Heaven, which I'm using triclopyr.
Yep.
And I'd love to know somebody, these people who are totally anti-chemical. It's like, okay, I wash my hands after I pump gasoline. I don't want heptane being on my hands,
Right.
And it's a known carcinogen. And, but at the same time, it's like, you have goats climb Tree of Heaven and eat it down to the ground. Like,
right.
Some things just simply need to be handled by man's intervention and innovation, I should say. And I think that that's where there's been this movement of like, crimpers are super cool, but if you can't afford it or you just simply can't wrap your mind around spending them, even if you can't afford it, like, I just don't want to spend it. Don't feel like there's no other options.
Right.
There's a lot of other options. I mean, for many years, guys were rolling and spraying a lighter, quart per acre of glyphosate, and they were just rolling it to give them good thatch cover.
Yep.
And then they'd spray it.
Yep.
So
I got a nice 60-inch roller for $325. You know what I mean? Not a big deal. So
no.
And it's if it mashes it down and creates thatch, and I spray it with glyphosate again, how many years do I have to do that to catch up with an $8,000 crimper?
Right.
A lot.
And we're not even talking, if we really wanted to get fancy and calculate time value of money.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Like, then we could really get into some compounded interest components and be like,
yes.
Well, really, what's this cost of this crimper? And I'm somebody that you're not here for a long time. We're here for good. You got to enjoy your life. So,
yeah.
But I'm just saying, like, we have to think about this. And that's one of the things that bothers me is I think a lot of people get sold on, like, I can't build soil unless I'm spending $10,000 on a crimper.
Yeah.
It's like, again, it's cool someday. Good. Maybe I'll have one. I'm not against them at all. I think they're really sweet when guys mount them to the front end loader and they have the drill following behind.
Yep.
One of the things you got to be cognizant of with a drill, if you are drilling and you're going to mow, is clogging up the drill with the debris. Like, if you mow first,
yep.
So one thing I've said is, like, Well, a lot of times guys have found it's easier to drill first and then come back and flail mow it off, or even bush hog it off.
Yep.
You know, I've used bush hogging quite a bit, and guys go, well, it doesn't terminate everything 100%. But like, again, especially in the springtime, who cares?
Right.
Like, we're just capturing more photosynthesis. Like, that's the driver to all of this, is like photosynthetic energy capture. So if I have rye grain that I mowed down and it's bolting back or growing back a little bit, it's not going to be even able to bolt, and the deer are going to come by and nip it. Like, who cares? It's just not that big of a deal that if, you know, a little bit of stuff doesn't die. Like, you're getting your seed down, you're getting it covered, you're bush hogging it off to kind of reset, if you will. You're giving the microbes some food to eat, because they're going to eat all the stuff that was cut, right? That's all dead. It's decaying, it's releasing nutrients back into the soil, and so goes the cycle. So I'm a huge advocate of coming up with a plan that the grower is comfortable with. And, you know, let's work on that together, and come up with something that's like, all right, this is going to work for my little piece of heaven.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be this way or this way. Like, let's
Right.
try to just find something that works.
Yeah. One of the things I want to ask, I got two more questions for you before we wrap this baby up. But on my new field with the Johnson grass, kind of what I had thought my strategy might be is just to play the chemical game for the summer. Mow, spray, fight it that way, and then get a good rip on the soil to try to disturb. I know I'm playing, it's sort of 6 one way, half a dozen another. Do I tear up the root systems and the rhizomes and redistribute the seeds? Like, it already went to seed head and I mowed it down. So what I'm hoping is whatever regen I get this year, as I nuke it, you know, that's not creating new. So, you know, that the root system there is at least not going to multiply, that I might be able to keep baseline where it's at and then progressively fight it back. Do I have to go with the spring mix? Can I just start with the fall mix? You know, am I running a risk there? Obviously, you've got a system set up, and preferably you're going to start spring. But if I buy your fall seed mix, I'm a guy that missed spring. So another good example would be my big food plot in our creek bottom. I typically only plant that in the fall because I can't get a tractor down to it till we get a dozer out there and fix some of the you know, good old fashioned Appalachian topography. It's a little too wet to get a tractor in and out. I can get it down there. It'll be an adventure, but it's probably not coming back up out of there until July. Yeah. So planning in, you know, late July, August, whatever that is, seems to be advantageous for the bottom. And that's the bulk of my, you know, of my 5 acres worth of plots. That's 3.5.
Yeah.
So, you know, what if I start with your mix in the fall?
I mean, you absolutely can. I mean, our fall mix is so diverse. You got 5 grains, 5 brassicas, different types of brassicas, from a turnip to forage types. You have legumes in there, so you have your clovers in there as well. So you're going to get nitrogen fixation. You absolutely can start there. I mean, it doesn't matter. You know, grains will grow on the back of a pickup truck. I don't know what kind of nutrients rye grain needs, but it ain't a lot, you know.
Yep.
And it has such a fibrous root system. It sequesters, or mines, or two terms that are kind of key terms you'll hear a lot in the marketplace. It'll do that really, really well, and it'll grow really easily, and the deer will eat the snot out of it. So you can absolutely start in the fall. Yep. You could actually leave, like, I would even tell guys, if like they're like, I only got a 1/4 acre or half acre, and I'd like to support you, but I just don't have this time to implement the whole system. My recommendation would say, okay, plant in the fall and leave it till the next fall. Don't worry if it's ugly. Right. Don't worry that you're going to have rye grain as tall as your head. You're going to have fawns in there. You're going to have turkeys in there. I got pictures of the buck I shot this year. I actually let the field go that I shot him out of last summer, and he's standing in front of the camera. I don't know what it was, August 19th or something. And he's standing in front of the camera eating, I think, clover that had grown up at this point is like 12 inches high.
Yeah.
And there's rye grain that's dead. It's all brown, standing next to him. And he's got probably covered damn near to his shoulder. And he's sitting there eating, just in the camera, like, used to give me all these fake, you know, pictures because everything would blow in front of it. But it was just like a really cool thing. And I killed him a couple months later. That's 10 awesome. Foot from where he was standing. So you, and actually on that particular field, what I did last year is I seeded my spring mix right into the standing, and whatever came up, whatever didn't. And I had sunflowers growing, buckwheat, everything just filled in it was just a mess of awesome wildlife habitat,
Right.
And I spot sprayed. I had a couple thistle here and there on that, especially on the edges and stuff. I just spot spray it. So my recommendation is, if you have something where you need to get some work done first, is I don't want people to feel disappointed. I don't want people to feel like, this isn't worth it. So I would say get the work done, get it treated, start with the fall. And then, on those larger fields, you're definitely going to want to implement that spring, because we can reduce our reliance on synthetic fertilizers.
Right.
Over time, like I've been very fortunate to have high CEC soils. I can cycle nutrients. The biggest thing on that is it's very difficult to cycle nutrients if they all walk off the field. So you got to keep that in the back of your mind, because if you're like, man, I thought I was never going to have to use fertilizers again, or I was going to be able to wean off fertilizers, you are going to be able to wean off. I don't care who you are, the system's going to work through biological systems. But if the white-tailed deer are removing 80% of your browse, well, first off, photosynthetic energy stops. I posted some things in the forum about that from some cattle studies out of Oklahoma State University. So you're going to have photosynthetic energy stop. You're going to have root production stop. That's not good for a microbiome, right? That's not good for nutrient cycling. The other thing you're going to have is the deer leave. They're not depositing it all right there. You have some, of course, but they leave. It's not like cows. They don't be herded together. You can keep them in a 1 acre paddock, and we can control browse pressure. And then once they remove so much, we can move them to a next paddock. Like, the deer are going to leave, and there goes your nutrients. So I tell guys that because, again, I don't ever want to feel like I'm just selling something. Like, I want people to understand the system and how it works. And like, there's a lot that entails this. And that's what kills me about just like general, it's soil building.
Right.
I mean, I could talk for hours about how much goes into the term soil building,
Right.
So those are some things to keep in mind. But if you just wanted to start with the fall and even leave that up all year for those smaller areas, think of the tonnage that you're getting.
Yeah. Right.
Way
more than what I get now.
Right. And you're getting the natural life cycles or ending of certain species as other plants are taking off. So like your clovers, the following spring are going to be taken off. Your ryegrain's going to bolt. Your ryegrain's going to life out, right? If you're leaving it all year till the following fall. And then you can decide, do I just want to mow everything off? And it'll be basically like a clover field. You might have some reseeded brassicas. Do you want to spray it off? But you could literally get it down to a spray a year on those smaller fields. You're not going to get as good a benefit as you would with the two, but it's still something that's worth considering on those smaller pieces.
Right. So last question for you. And I know this is a talk about for a long time type of thing. So I'm going to open up a big box, but I want you to, I'm going to channel my inner old Jared here and say, give me the concise answer. I talked a lot. I'm introducing somebody who's not from around here to this community. They moved up here for work. We drove around today. We're looking at things, and we talked a little bit about soil types. And so I think one of the more depressing things for someone in my area is red clay. And you buy yourself a farm. And I just happened to look at a piece of property the other day, 479 acres. It's a beautiful tract of ground. There's some great hardwoods on it. And then they showed some of the log, what we call log landings or oil well sites. And it is just textbook, build a brick road, red clay. Give a guy hope that if he's got a farm in red clay country, that it doesn't always have to be terrible soil, that there's a way to use your system, break that soil down over time, introduce the nutrients, and really rebuild that soil, quite literally, pun intended, from the ground up.
Well, yeah, that buck I shot this past year was shot over High Point, which was an old log landing.
Yep.
So, I mean, I can empathize to that situation to the nth degree. I mean, he was 5.5-year-old, and I think I shared some video even I took of him before I killed him, about 30 minutes before I killed him. And I mean, that field looks like it's in the middle of Iowa.
It looks amazing. Yep.
And it's interesting because I find that field tends to lend itself a little bit more towards grains than it does brassicas.
Yeah.
I think that's something about more so one of the soil scientists at Ward Labs, he and I have been having a discussion. I had done a YouTube video about this about a year or two ago, about how the soil profile can likely determine in highly diverse mixes what is going to succeed. Not saying you're not going to have any germination or anything, but what is going to succeed and be greener and more lush versus some of the other things. And I've noticed that field tends to lend itself a little bit more towards the grains and huge tubers. And I think that's somewhat of an element of some compaction. There's a lot of weight on a logging deck, as you know, especially with so CEC is the higher the CEC number, typically you're going to have the more clay-based soil. Eventually you get into like humus or humics and things like that, or really high organic matter, like swampy conditions is what I'm looking for.
Yep.
But basically, those soils that are heavy clay are really high CECs, which is a positive in the sense that we can hold a lot of nutrients. So it's not like sand, right? We're not catching nutrients in a stream. Yep. Right. But the negative of that is that we want to look at our base saturations. This is where soil sampling can really be helpful, because before we allow biology to do all of the work that we want biology to do, if we can soil sample and get our calcium, magnesium, and potassium base saturations, especially calcium and magnesium, in a good ratio. So if you have your calcium in the right percentage, we can allow the soil to be more porous. Okay. Magnesium, if magnesium is too high, it actually makes the soil very tight. So I've looked at soil samples before, and a guy has 8 CEC soil, and I'll look at his magnesium base saturation percentage, and I'm like, I bet you if you stuck a shovel in that soil, you tell me it's tight as could be, right?
Yep.
And they're like, yeah. How'd you know that? I'm like, because your magnesium's way too high. So those are an antagonistic relationship. So as we increase our calcium, it'll naturally push your magnesium off the soil colloid. But without going down that whole rabbit hole, that's a general reason, really fast, why it's important to just get a basic soil sample, and not one of these ones that doesn't give you this information. If somebody did one and they don't give you base saturations, shoot me a message, and I have a website that I use, and we can calculate it. But just pay a few extra bucks and get a soil sample that gives you the base saturation percentages. Once we have this, and this is why I'm not like anti-amendment, right? Like I think it's good to get, well, calcium most of the time can just be altered with lime. Lime, by the way, just a quick caveat, because it's something that irks me a little bit. So calcium doesn't impact pH. People think calcium impacts pH. Calcium pushes hydrogen off of the soil colloid, which reacts with the carbonate in lime to neutralize pH. So if somebody, don't think calcium impacts pH. I'll just leave it at that. But it's really often confused, and it's not exactly the case, but it somewhat works synergistically in that sense. But you could have a perfect pH, and why I'm saying that you could have a perfect pH or damn near, and have a little bit too low of calcium. So you could still potentially benefit from increasing your calcium base saturations. That's where you would, instead of use lime, you could use gypsum, you could use a liquid calcium product on a foliar application. Yeah. So don't count that out. So now let's say we got our base saturation, we got a plant at least, but we got to get roots growing, right? Like biology and root exudation, when plants are photosynthesizing, is, again, that feeds the world, man. That's energy capture. That's solar panels are mimicking what God did with photosynthesis, right? Like that's the whole idea. So we need to get plants growing. Just keeping it fallow isn't going to do anything. So diversity in plants is important because you get all these fungal benefits, right? So we're feeding mycorrhizal fungi. Fungi helps to break down higher carbon to nitrogen ratios. It can release enzymes that make things that are bound up in the soil profile. For, let's just talk phosphorus, for example. As the roots communicate to the fungal networks can communicate to basically geology, and it can solubilize these things and it can release these things and make it bioavailable. So now these plants, whether it's this crop or the next crop, are taking these back up, and we're again cycling nutrients.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to not go too far down this rabbit hole because I can, and it's it's annoying. I'm sure it's annoying for the listeners, but I want to give enough information that we have to understand that not only is it important to have diversity from a root structure perspective and a plant perspective, but we're creating diversity in your microbiome through a fungal and biology perspective. And what that's doing is allowing us to cycle those nutrients back through and up into the plants. So as we do this over time, we are able to then create better soil aggregation because we're making the soil more porous, right? Because we're having these root exudations happening. We're not, hopefully, in those type of heavy clay situations. It's human nature a lot of times to think, I got to really just plow the piss out of it. Right. I'm not against that for like a one time. Like a good buddy of mine, actually, he's probably in a very similar soil. It's up to you looked at there, and I don't think he's in Washington County, but it's in Athens County, but it's 25 minutes or so west of Parkersburg, I think is like the rough.
General Coolville area. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're like right in that general area. And like he had an area where he's like, man, the compaction just seems too great. So he plowed it one time. And then he had come up with a plan. I didn't really help him, but he and I talk all the time. He's a really good friend of mine. And he added some biological primers there, some fungal inoculants, because he's really trying to like reset this system. And it's only been, I think, a year, but he's having some really good success already, just seeing soil structure change. So my point is as you have these systems work and you're cycling your nutrients and you're increasing your microbial activity and you're creating soil aggregation, you're going to be able to, over time, essentially, like you said, build the soil up, right? So you're trying to build it from from where it's at to the top. But then again, the stuff that's already there, that's heavily compacted, clays and things like that, we're going to be able to make that more porous and more alive, if you will. Yep. So with those different root channels, as they're breaking down, right? So you have root, and then that plant dies. Well, the root system's still there. So it gives opportunity for water. You increase your water infiltration. You increase all of these things that are happening and that we need to happen. Because again, that's one of the issues with these systems a lot too. If really heavy compacted clay soil is water hits the soil. And if you have no porosity, what does it do? It's in the Ohio River. It has nowhere to go. But if you have roots there and thatch there to slow the water down, now your water's infiltrating. It's infiltrating the root pores. Forget about all the root exudation, all that stuff that's happening, which is super cool. And it's creating well aggregated soil. It's creating areas for microbes to travel. It's increasing your fungal networks that are breaking down really compacted soil and making it more porous. It's creating areas for earthworms to live. You're literally creating habitat, right? But it also starts with the water too. You're increasing an area for the water to go. Better water infiltration. Rainfall is one of the number one leading reasons for compaction of soil. People think it's mechanical and all this stuff. It's actually can be rainfall on bare soil because it hits so hard and it's so consistent and so persistent that it will actually compact your soil. And that's where having thatch and a constant root growing and highly diverse mixes where you're like in our mix in the fall, we have several species that will live and be feeding the microbes all winter long.
Right.
You're having like essentially no fallow period. You're constantly feeding the microbes. Well, if you're feeding the microbes, good things are happening. So that was like the short version of me answering that question. I probably could keep going because there's like 1,000 other ideas, but it's an awesome question because I think you could almost, again, start with the soil test, but you could literally make a plan on every piece of ground, depending on the grower's goals. And it might vary from half mile to a half mile, depending on that individual's goals. But you definitely can make it better than it is.
Yep, I agree. I think some guys just see that and they think, oh man, there's nothing possible here. So thank you for the partially in-depth answer to that. Man, I appreciate your enthusiasm for what you're doing. Thank you so much. So Albert has a thread on the Ohio Outdoors Forum called, what is it? No-till plots so easy. I'll link that in the description. All of the in-depth knowledge that we didn't get into tonight is definitely embedded in that thread. I'm very proud to say that is probably one of the finest no-till food plot threads on any forum anywhere. And you deserve all the credit. You've definitely have poured a lot of thought and energy in that. I appreciate what you guys are doing with the seed company, the Habitat food, the Habitat thread. What's the official Facebook page name now? Didn't you guys just change it?
Habitat Chat by Habitat Podcast.
That's right. Habitat Chat by Habitat Podcast. We'll get that link too. Been following along for 2 or 3 years now, pretty much since the origination. What I appreciate most about that Facebook feed is just the diversity in the conversation and getting to see a lot of different guys doing a lot of different things all over the country. And you, Jared, others, Brian, are on top of it with good quality advice. And, I think there was a time where like QDMA, Archery Talk, all those forums were leading the way. And as a forum owner, I hate to say that that's an antiquated style of communication. I think it has its place, but Facebook also has its place. And that page in particular for the food plot guy, the habitat guy, and it's one of the finest resources that I've come across in terms of my social media engagement over the years.
Well, we try really hard. Facebook is a very difficult, it's a really, really, really difficult medium to admin on. It just, I think that's one of the things that I love about the forum so much is like, I can go on there, I can share 3 paragraphs, and some people read it, some people don't. But there's very rarely this negative vibe or animosity. And like Facebook, you just have so many personalities. It's like traveling in an airport. Like you're gonna run into an asshole.
Yeah.
You travel enough, you're like, oh, you can see him coming. You're like, oh, this guy at B6, he's an asshole. Like those certain people.
For
and
sure.
Facebook has that, and it's been such a awesome feeling to see that group just has it. Like we just have really kept it. There's been a guy here or there, and Jared will text me and be like, yep, he's gone. Like, we're just not going to deal with it because it's like we're all busy. But I just keep coming back to the Ohio Outdoors. I don't know how long. I think it's been 10 years now I've been on there, but I don't even know if that's right. I think I had an old username that I lost because it feels like it's been longer than that. But you guys have had it for 12 years now?
Yeah, it'll be 12 years this August.
Yeah, so I feel like I was on there like right at the beginning. Maybe I wasn't, but it's been awesome, and I really appreciate you having me on. I'm sorry I jump around all the time. It's just kind of how I am. People call me, and I jump around on a lot of different topics, but I enjoy it, and hopefully there was something in there that was halfway informative for people. And I love doing the thread, man. I'm going to keep it up and keep sharing and keep documenting. There's a lot of big things to come, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, man, you definitely have a contagious enthusiasm about most of the things you do, but certainly about soil health and composition and all of those things we discussed. So I look forward to getting this one out and letting people listen to it and hearing some of the feedback. Appreciate your time tonight, bud.
Anytime, buddy. Anytime. I appreciate you.
All right. Thank you.